Dinner was always a time for a quiet reflection for Neil. He wasn't one for grand gestures or loud conversations. The clinking of silverware, the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the corner, and the soft whisper of the wind outside were the only sounds that punctuated the stillness of the evening. It was an odd comfort for Neil, this silence. It gave him space to think, to plan, to organize the chaos of his mind. Gracie sat across from him, her gaze flicking nervously from the plate in front of her to Neil. She had always been unpredictable, a woman driven by emotion rather than logic. Tonight, however, something was different. Neil could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, like the calm before a storm. He knew this moment was coming. He had known for a long time. And now, as she fidgeted with her fork, her movements betraying her nerves, Neil couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm. He had prepared for this moment. "You're awfully quiet tonight," Gracie said, her voice trembling slightly. Neil looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time that evening. She was waiting for a reaction, expecting him to feel something, anything, at the mention of their growing distance. "I'm just thinking," Neil replied, his tone neutral, "about what comes next." Gracie's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but she didn't say anything. She was waiting, still hoping for some kind of emotional reaction from him. Neil knew this game all too well. It was her way of testing him, seeing if she could break through his calm exterior. He had seen it before, her desperation to provoke him, to make him feel as vulnerable as she did. But Neil wasn't like other men. He had learned long ago how to keep his emotions in check, how to control his reactions, how to keep everything buried under the surface. Then, as if on cue, Gracie finally spoke the words that had been hanging between them for so long. "Neil," she said, her voice shaky but resolute, "I think it's time for a divorce." Neil didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He didn't react at all. He simply took a slow sip of his wine, watching her from across the table. The silence between them stretched on, thick and heavy. Gracie's face contorted with frustration. She had expected something, anything, anger, shock, maybe even a plea for reconciliation. But there was nothing. Neil remained as calm as ever. "I've been expecting this," Neil said finally, his voice as steady as a rock. The words hung in the air, and Gracie's frustration deepened. She couldn't understand why he wasn't reacting. She had pushed him to the brink, and yet he remained unchanged. It was as if she had never mattered to him at all. "You've been expecting this?" she asked, her voice rising in disbelief. "Why didn't you say anything?" Neil's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Because I knew this moment would come. You've been building up to it for months, Gracie. It was only a matter of time." The calm in his voice unnerved her. She had thought that her confession would shake him, make him feel the weight of what they had built together. But instead, it was as if she had just confirmed what he already knew. He wasn't surprised, and that made her feel small. Gracie leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "You knew? Then why didn't you do something about it? Why didn't you fight for this marriage?" Neil set his glass down carefully, his gaze never leaving her. "I did fight, Gracie, in my own way. But you've been fighting too. You just didn't realize it." She recoiled slightly, confused by his response. "What do you mean?" Neil didn't answer immediately. He pushed his chair back, standing up slowly, his movements deliberate. Gracie watched him, still trying to piece together his strange calmness. "You really don't remember, do you?" Neil said softly, his eyes now cold, almost distant. "The prenuptial agreement." Gracie's heart skipped a beat. The words hit her like a slap in the face. The prenuptial agreement. Of course. The document they had signed years ago, when everything had seemed so perfect, so secure. She had almost forgotten about it. The thought of it, now, made her stomach turn. She had hoped that, in the event of a divorce, it would be a simple, clean break. But now, with Neil's calm revelation, she realized just how little control she actually had over the situation. "I made sure everything was in order long before this conversation happened." Neil continued, his voice still measured. "This isn't going to be a messy divorce, Gracie. It's going to be clean just like I planned." Gracie felt the walls closing in on her. Her anger flared, and she clenched her fists beneath the table. But Neil was unshaken. He had already won. Why? She demanded, struggling to keep her voice steady. Why all of this, Neil? Why would it get this far? Neil met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Because I've known exactly who you are, Gracie. I've known for a long time, and I've been preparing for this day, waiting for you to finally make the move. I knew you couldn't resist. The weight of his words hung in the air, thick with a sense of finality. Gracie could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. This wasn't just a marriage falling apart. It was a game, and Neil had already won. The night dragged on in a haze of confusion for Gracie. She couldn't shake the words Neil had said to her. I've known exactly who you are. The coldness in his tone, the way he spoke of their marriage as if it were nothing more than a strategy, made her feel small, insignificant, like a pawn in a game she never knew she was playing. After the dinner, Gracie retreated to their bedroom, trying to make sense of everything. Neil, as usual, was calm, while she seethed, struggling with the idea that her marriage had always been a calculation for him. Neil remained unfazed, focused only on the next step in his plan. Gracie paced the room, her thoughts a jumble of anger and disbelief. She had pushed him, yes, but she never imagined that Neil, the quiet, reserved man she had married, had been playing this game all along. Her thoughts kept circling back to the prenuptial agreement. How could I have been so stupid? She thought bitterly. It was a document she had agreed to years ago, but in the heat of their relationship, she had dismissed its importance, believing it would never be needed. Now, with the reality of divorce looming, that oversight seemed catastrophic. Neil had been preparing for this moment from the beginning, and Gracie had never even noticed. The next day, the divorce papers arrived in the mail. They were neatly stacked, professionally done, and there, at the bottom, was a note from Neil's lawyer, reminding Gracie of the ironclad terms of their agreement. The weight of it hit her as she read each line. She was entitled to none of their shared wealth, not a penny. The house, the assets, even the cars, none of it was hers to claim. The realization sank in slowly, like a stone settling to the bottom of a lake. Neil had not only anticipated her request for a divorce, but he had already arranged for the paperwork, the legal proceedings, everything. I've been set up, Gracie thought, her heart pounding with a mix of rage and panic. The years of their marriage had all been leading to this point, where she would walk away with nothing, and he would walk away unscathed. But Gracie wasn't one to give up easily. She had always been resourceful, able to manipulate situations to her advantage. And she wasn't about to let Neil win so effortlessly. The next day, she took action. She called her lawyer, trying to rally some defense, hoping to find a loophole, some way to fight back. As she explained the situation, she was met with the grim realization that Neil had already outmaneuvered her. Her lawyer, though sympathetic, told her that the prenuptial agreement left little room for negotiation. Unless there's something new, he said, unless you have evidence of some wrongdoing, there's not much we can do. Gracie hung up the phone, a sinking feeling in her chest. She couldn't believe it. She had assumed that if she pushed hard enough, Neil would break, or at least show some sign of weakness. But he hadn't. He had been prepared for this, every step of the way. Her next move was to attempt to provoke Neil into an emotional reaction. She needed him to slip up, to make a mistake that would give her leverage in the court. So, she began pushing harder. She threw passive-aggressive comments at him, tried to make him feel guilty, to make him regret his cold attachment. But Neil remained perfectly composed. Every time she tried to provoke him, he simply smiled, a faint, knowing smile, and would calmly return to whatever he was doing. It's like he's playing me, Gracie thought. I can't even get a rise out of him anymore. Weeks passed, and the divorce proceedings continued with a chilling efficiency. Neil's lawyer was always one step ahead, sending over legal documents, making sure every detail was taken care of. Gracie, in her desperation, tried to fight back by manipulating the situation in her favor. But each time, Neil's moves were calculated and deliberate. He never once faltered, never once gave her the satisfaction of seeing him break. Then came the court hearing. Gracie thought that perhaps this would be her chance. She imagined that once they were in front of the judge, she could pull some trick, expose a weakness in Neil's strategy. She had no idea what exactly she was hoping for. Maybe a tear, a slip of his composure. But what happened next shocked her to her core. As the hearing began, Neil's lawyer stood and calmly presented evidence. Gracie's eyes widened in disbelief as a photograph of her and Mark, her boss, surfaced. It was taken during a trip to the office party, and it was clear that she and Mark had been more than just colleagues. The affair she had been hiding from Neil for months was now exposed in front of everyone. Gracie's heart raced, panic rising in her chest as she tried to make sense of it all. How had Neil known? How had he uncovered the affair? She hadn't even realized she was under surveillance, but Neil had been watching her all along, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The room fell silent as Neil's lawyer continued. As you can see, the defendant's actions have not only broken the trust in their marriage, but have also raised serious concerns regarding their character. This evidence, though painful, is part of the reason why we are requesting the full enforcement of the prenuptial agreement. Gracie's face flushed with humiliation. She could feel the eyes of the court on her, the shame of her actions seeping deep into her bones. Neil's calmness was suffocating. She could barely look at him, but when she did, he wasn't angry. He wasn't even upset. He was simply resolute. He had known everything, had been waiting for this moment to claim his victory. The judge turned to Gracie. Given the evidence presented, I'm afraid I have no choice but to enforce the terms of the prenuptial agreement. You will have 30 days to vacate the property, and you will not be entitled to any part of the assets accumulated during the marriage. The words were like a blow to the chest. Gracie felt the ground fall away beneath her. There was no financial support, no cushioned escape from the fallout of her choices. She was left with nothing but the weight of her actions and the realization that Neil had already won. As the hearing adjourned, Gracie left the courtroom in a daze. The world around her seemed to spin, and for the first time, she understood just how deeply she had miscalculated everything. Neil had prepared for this moment long before she had even realized there was a game to be played. Gracie's world seemed to crumble around her as the finality of the court's decision sank in. 30 days to leave the house, stripped of everything she had once thought was hers. The wealth, the property, the life they had built, none of it was hers anymore. The overwhelming emptiness she felt was suffocating. She had pushed Neil too far, manipulated the situation, and in the end, he had outsmarted her at every turn. Back at their house, the walls that had once seemed so familiar now felt foreign, alien. Gracie wandered through the rooms, packing her things with a sense of numbness. Each item she picked up, the wedding photos, the trinkets that decorated their home, felt like a mockery of the life she thought they had. As she sifted through their bedroom, her hands brushing across the sheets, she noticed something odd. A leather-bound journal sat on the corner of Neil's nightstand, half hidden beneath a pile of papers. It was out of place, something she hadn't seen before. Curiosity tugged at her, and against her better judgment, she picked it up. It was strange. She had never thought of Neil as the type to keep a journal, let alone one that was so carefully hidden. She opened it, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the pages. The writing inside was neat and precise, each entry dated and detailed. At first, the words seemed like innocent musings, reflections on their marriage, small observations about the mundane. But as Gracie read further, a chill crept down her spine. The journal was filled with Neil's thoughts, but not just about their life together. There were entries about her, about the way she behaved, the way she had pushed him to the edge. But what struck her most was the methodical way he had mapped out his strategy. Neil had been watching her, studying her every move, every interaction. He had known her patterns, the way she manipulated situations, the way she played on emotions to get what she wanted. He had even recorded the moments when she had tried to provoke him into a reaction, something she thought had gone unnoticed, but had all been calculated. He had seen right through her, and while she thought she was in control, he had already planned his moves, waiting for the right moment to strike. The pages of the journal revealed that Neil had anticipated every move she would make. The prenuptial agreement, the divorce, it had all been part of his plan from the beginning. Gracie's betrayal, her affair with Mark, had not been a surprise. Neil had known about it long before the affair had even begun. The affair was just another part of the chessboard, another move in the game he had been playing with her all along. Gracie slammed the journal shut, her breath quickening as the weight of the realization hit her. She had been so consumed with her own desires, her own plans, that she had never seen Neil for what he truly was, a strategist, a man who had always been 3 steps ahead. The shame of it was unbearable. She had thought she was outsmarting him, that she was the one in control. But Neil had been silently manipulating her the entire time. Every time she had tried to provoke him, to make him feel the way she felt, he had been calmly observing, waiting for the right moment to execute his plan. Gracie threw the journal back onto the nightstand, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. It was clear that Neil had already won, but she couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. How could he have been so calm, so detached, when everything she had done had been driven by emotion? She had tried to break him, to push him into a reaction, but he had never faltered. Neil had been in control all along, and now, as she faced the consequences of her own actions, she realized just how deeply she had miscalculated. But there was more. As Gracie closed her eyes, the weight of her mistakes seemed to press down on her even harder. She had always believed that Neil's detachment was a flaw, that he was too distant, too unemotional. But now, she saw it for what it truly was, his greatest strength. He had never been vulnerable, never given her the satisfaction of seeing him hurt. And that was why he had been able to control everything, from the smallest interactions to the biggest decisions. The next day, Gracie decided to take action. She had nothing left to lose. She called Mark, hoping to salvage something from the wreckage of her life. But when Mark answered the phone, his voice was distant, cold. She had expected him to be sympathetic, to offer some kind of support. But instead, Mark's tone was harsh, as if he had already moved on from her. "You've ruined everything," Mark said flatly. "I can't be part of this anymore, Gracie. This is too much." Gracie's heart sank. The affair, the betrayal, it had all been for nothing. Neil had already known, had already played his hand, and now even Mark was distancing himself. The walls were closing in on her from all sides. As she hung up the phone, Gracie knew that there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. Neil had outmaneuvered her in every way, and now, with the house slipping through her fingers and her relationships crumbling, she was left with nothing. But the worst part, the part she couldn't shake, was the realization that Neil had known all along. He had been silently observing, waiting for her to make the mistakes that would bring her down. With a heavy heart, Gracie sat down on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. She had thought that she was the one in control, but now, she saw how foolish she had been. Neil had always been 10 steps ahead, and now, she was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had been carefully orchestrated by him from the very beginning. The days that followed were a blur of cold realizations and overwhelming regret for Gracie. The house, once a symbol of their life together, now felt like a prison. She moved through each room in a daze, packing the few belongings that Neil hadn't already claimed. His silence was suffocating, yet there was a strange comfort in it for him, as though this was exactly how he wanted things to unfold. He had been patient, waiting for her to reach this point, and now she was the one scrambling to make sense of the aftermath of her own choices. Gracie had always believed she knew Neil. She thought she understood his quiet, reserved nature, chalking it up to a lack of emotional depth or passion. She had misjudged him entirely. What she hadn't seen, what she couldn't have known, was that Neil's calm was not indifference. It was control. The calmness she had so often mistaken for apathy was, in fact, the key to his success in this cruel, calculated game. And now, Gracie was trapped, the victim of a strategy she never saw coming. Each time she looked at him, Neil's composed demeanor seemed to mock her. He had not raised his voice. He had not fought back. He had simply let her self-destruct, and now she was left with nothing. On the afternoon, when she was packing the last of her things, Neil walked into the room. Gracie barely looked up, unwilling to engage, but his presence felt like a heavy weight on her chest. "I assume you've packed everything," Neil said, his voice calm as always. Gracie didn't respond. She wanted to scream at him, to demand why he hadn't shown any emotion, any vulnerability. She wanted him to feel something, anything, but she knew it was pointless. Neil didn't show emotions like she did. His silence had always been part of his armor. I've arranged for a moving company to help you, Neil continued, his tone matter of fact. Everything's in place. Gracie finally looked up, meeting his gaze, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. I don't need your help, Neil. He nodded slightly, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that only deepened her frustration. Of course, but it's already taken care of. She wanted to lash out, but there was something about his calmness, something about the way he held himself, that kept her from doing so. The more she fought, the more she realized how carefully he had controlled every aspect of their marriage. Every argument, every moment of tension had been part of a larger plan she could not even fathom. As the days dwindled down to the final hours of her stay in the house, Gracie felt the walls close in tighter. The truth she had been avoiding for so long hit her all at once. Neil had been playing a game, and she had been his unwitting pawn. And now, she was losing. In the quiet moments of her final days in the house, Gracie found herself drawn to the one thing she could never quite escape: Neil's journal. She had tried to move on, to put out of her mind, but something about the way it had revealed Neil's methodical planning, his calculated moves, kept pulling her back. She couldn't help but want to understand how he had pulled it off. She needed to know the depths of his strategy. One night, while Neil was out, Gracie found herself holding the journal once more. She opened it, her fingers tracing the pages that detailed not only his thoughts on their marriage, but also the meticulous notes about her behavior, her flaws, her patterns. The journal revealed something deeper than she had realized. Neil hadn't just planned for the divorce. He had been preparing for her downfall from the moment they married. As she read, one entry caught her attention. It was dated 6 months before their wedding anniversary, and it read, Asterisk, Gracie's emotional volatility is both her greatest strength and her most dangerous weakness. She thrives on emotional chaos, but I will turn that against her. Every action she takes will be a move in my game. I will let her believe she's in control until she's trapped by her own impulses. Asterisk, Gracie's heart pounded in her chest as she read those words. Neil had known. He had studied her, watched her every move, and had used her own behavior against her. Every time she had tried to manipulate him, every time she had pushed him to react, he had been quietly taking note, waiting for the perfect moment to expose her. And now, the moment had come. Her mind raced as she realized the full extent of Neil's control. Even when she had been most vulnerable, when she had been trying to provoke him or manipulate him, Neil had been 10 steps ahead. He had made sure that her every mistake was carefully documented, carefully used to ensure that she would have no escape. With a heavy heart, Gracie closed the journal, the weight of her defeat settling in. She was outplayed, outsmarted, and now she was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. There was no escaping the consequences of her actions, no hiding from the reality that Neil had orchestrated everything. The house, the divorce, her affair, all of it had been carefully constructed by him, and she had walked right into his trap. As the last day in the house approached, Gracie found herself at a crossroads. She could leave, as Neil had ordered, and start over, but with nothing to her name. Or she could stay and fight back, try to find a way to take control of her life again. But deep down, she knew the truth. Neil had already won. There was no fighting against a man who had planned every detail of her downfall. The final day came sooner than Gracie expected. Her things were packed, the house was eerily silent, and the weight of her situation hung heavily over her like an oppressive fog. Neil's calm presence seemed to follow her every step, watching from the corners of the house like an ever-present shadow. He didn't need to say anything. His silence spoke volumes, a silent reminder of the control he held over everything, over her, over their marriage, over her very life. Gracie stood at the window, gazing out at the familiar view. It felt like a lifetime ago that she had looked out at this same scenery with a sense of hope, believing that her life with Neil was something permanent, something secure. Now, it all felt like an illusion. The marriage, the love she thought they shared, and even the home they had built together, all of it had been a part of a grander plan she hadn't even realized. Her mind kept going back to that journal. It haunted her, gnawing at her every thought. She had been outplayed, manipulated, and now, as she packed her last few belongings, she knew there was no escape. The terms of the divorce were clear, and the prenuptial agreement had sealed her fate. She had no claim to their assets, no support, no safety net. Everything she had once known was slipping through her fingers like sand. Just then, the door to the room opened, and Neil stepped inside. He didn't need to say anything. He simply stood there, watching her in that detached, almost indifferent way that had come to define him. "Everything's ready," Neil said quietly, breaking the silence. Gracie's heart sank. She was prepared to leave, but the finality of it all still hit her like a punch to the gut. "I'm leaving," she replied, her voice hollow. "I don't need your help anymore." Neil nodded, as if her words didn't faze him. "I know." Gracie's anger flared up again, but she swallowed it. What was the point? She had fought him, tried to manipulate him, and yet he had remained calm and unbroken. Neil's presence was like a silent reminder of how much he had controlled. Even now, as she prepared to leave, it was clear he was the one who had set everything in motion, even orchestrating her exit. "I don't understand," Gracie said, her voice cracking, though she tried to keep her composure. "Why didn't you ever fight for us? For this marriage?" Neil took a step forward, his expression unchanged. "I did fight, Gracie, in my own way, but you never wanted the same things I did. You wanted chaos, you wanted control, and I let you believe you had it. I let you push me, manipulate me, but you didn't realize that I was always in control. From the beginning." The words hit her like a slap. He had been playing her all along. Gracie suddenly realized that all the little things she had ignored, the calmness, the absence of emotional outbursts, his complete composure in the face of her provocations, were all part of his plan. Neil had never been emotionally invested in their marriage the way she had been. He had seen it for what it was, a game of strategy, and he had played it perfectly. "Don't pretend this is about me," Gracie said, her anger resurfacing. "You didn't love me. You never did." Neil's gaze didn't falter. "I loved you in my way, but not in the way you wanted. I didn't need to prove it with emotions or displays of affection. You were always too focused on manipulating me to notice that." The harsh truth of his words hit Gracie like a cold wave. She had been too wrapped up in her own needs, her own desires, to see the reality of their relationship. Neil had never been the emotional partner she wanted, but in the end, he had been a more disciplined, more focused one. While she had acted out of impulse and emotion, Neil had made calculated decisions, planning each move with precision. As the minutes ticked by, Gracie found herself unable to respond. She was exhausted, emotionally, mentally, physically. The fight she had been carrying for so long had drained her, leaving her with nothing but the cold reality of what she had lost. Then Neil spoke again, his tone now softer, though still measured. "I'm not doing this to hurt you, Gracie. I'm doing this to protect myself. I gave you everything I could, but you kept pushing. Now, you have to face the consequences of your actions." Gracie's heart twisted at his words. She had pushed him, yes, but she had never imagined it would end like this. She had thought that by causing chaos, she could force Neil into showing some emotion, some weakness. But he had never been the man she thought he was. Neil had seen through her from the start, and while she had been playing on her impulses, he had been carefully biding his time, waiting for the moment when she would make a fatal mistake. "I'll be gone soon," Gracie said quietly, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. Neil nodded. "I'll make sure the moving company is here by the end of the day. Everything will be taken care of." Gracie didn't know what else to say. She had no energy left for a final confrontation, no strength to argue with him any longer. Neil had one, and she had no choice but to accept it. As she gathered her last few belongings, the realization of her complete loss settled in. Neil had orchestrated every step of this. He had known all along that this was where they were headed, and now, as she stood on the edge of her departure, there was no turning back. Her mind raced with the weight of everything that had happened. The affair with Mark, the manipulation, the prenuptial agreement, the divorce. It was all falling apart, and yet Neil remained untouched, calm, and in control. Gracie had thought she was the one with the power, the one calling the shots. But in the end, Neil had outsmarted her at every turn. "Goodbye, Neil," Gracie said, her voice barely a whisper. Neil didn't reply. He simply turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the consequences of her actions. And as Gracie stood there, staring at the empty house, she realized that Neil's victory wasn't just about the divorce or the assets. It was about control. He had taken everything from her, not through anger or confrontation, but through patience and strategy. And now, as she prepared to leave, she was left with nothing but the hollow echo of her own mistakes. The house was quiet once more. Gracie stood in the center of the empty living room, the boxes filled with her belongings scattered around her. The walls that had once seemed so familiar now felt foreign and cold, like a tomb of a life she no longer recognized. The memories of the time she and Neil had shared here felt distant, like scenes from a dream, fading, slipping away with every passing moment. She glanced at the clock. The movers were due soon, and soon enough, the house would be completely empty, a shell of the life she had once thought she had. She had expected this moment to be filled with emotions, anger, regret, sadness, but instead there was only numbness. It was as if the weight of everything that had happened had finally crushed her, leaving nothing but a hollow shell. Gracie had tried to push Neil into reacting, to feel something, anything, but now she realized that all her efforts had been in vain. Neil had never been swayed by emotions. He had never been the type to get caught up in the chaos she had created. While she had acted out of frustration and impulsive desires, Neil had watched, studied, and waited. He had been playing a game that she hadn't even known existed. As the movers began loading the last of her belongings, Gracie walked out to the front porch and sat down on the steps, her mind reeling. Neil had already moved on, of course. He had known from the beginning that this was where it would end. As she sat there, she realized how deeply he had prepared for this moment. It wasn't just the prenuptial agreement or the meticulous legal steps he had taken. It was everything. His entire approach to their marriage had been methodical, controlled, and precise. Gracie's thoughts turned to the affair with Mark. She had thought it would be her escape, her way of taking control. But now, she understood that it had only been another piece in Neil's grand strategy. He had known about the affair from the start, had quietly watched as she made mistake after mistake, until finally, he had the leverage to end it all. She stood up and walked back inside, glancing at the now empty rooms. There were no more possessions, no more reminders of the life she had built. There was only the harsh reality of what Neil had done. He had taken everything from her, her home, her assets, her dignity, but most of all, he had taken her sense of control. She had thought she was playing the game, but in reality, she had been nothing more than a pawn in his hands. The reality of her situation sank in. She was alone. No money, no support, no future. She had burned every bridge, alienated everyone she had ever known, and now she was left to face the consequences of her actions. Gracie took one last look at the house, at the life she had once believed was hers. She thought about calling Mark, hoping to find some solace, some comfort in the aftermath. But when she picked up her phone, the number felt too distant, too disconnected from her reality. Mark had already distanced himself from her, and now Gracie understood why. Her actions had destroyed everything, not just with Neil, but with everyone who had been a part of her life. She had pushed them all away, and now she was left with nothing. Her fingers hovered over the phone screen, but she didn't make the call. Instead, she put the phone down and walked out of the house for the last time. The driveway was empty, the house was silent, and Gracie felt the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. She wasn't sure where to go, but one thing was clear: she couldn't stay here. There was nothing left for her in this place. So, she walked away, one step after another, as the sun began to set behind her, casting long shadows over the empty streets. As she walked, Gracie's mind kept returning to Neil's calm, to his unshakable control. She thought about the journal, the way Neil had written out his plans so methodically, so carefully. She had never been part of the plan. She had been a tool, a means to an end, and once she had served her purpose, she was discarded. Neil had never been the man she thought he was. He had been a strategist, a planner, and she had been a pawn in his game. The further Gracie walked, the more her sense of control slipped away. She had always thought that she could outsmart Neil, that she could force him into a reaction, but in the end, she had underestimated him. Neil had been prepared for everything. He had anticipated her every move, and now, as she walked away from the life they had shared, she realized the full extent of her defeat. The weight of her mistakes pressed down on her like a physical burden. The affair, the manipulation, the lies. Gracie had thought she could control the narrative, but now the truth was staring her in the face. Neil had been right all along. He had known exactly who she was, and he had played her every step of the way. The streetlights flickered on as night began to fall, and Gracie kept walking. There was nowhere to go, no place to turn. All she had was the cold, empty reality of what she had lost, and the knowledge that Neil had won.